Your coach's eye can be one of the most valuable things that you possess as a coach because it helps us make decisions in real time. But it can be a little bit tricky at times to know exactly what you need to be looking for and where you need to look. And that's why we're here today. I'm going to walk you through a very basic coach's eye progression. These are some of the things that I use with my athletes so that I can make decisions in real time. Because if an athlete comes to me and I'm working with them for the very first time, I don't have time to go take a look at the film or take a look at what I just recorded on my iPad. I need to be able to make decisions in real time. So these are some of the basic things that I take a look at. We need a decision-making process. We need to have a way to make decisions based on the things that we see. And for that, I use some very basic key performance indicators in question form. The first question is the athlete able to project themselves forward? Basically, how does the athlete move through space? Does the athlete project themselves forward? So for that, we could look at either step length, the length of each step that they're taking, or we can look at hip displacement. And hip displacement basically looks at our center of mass, our hips, and we use that to figure out how far our body is actually traveling. So we can have athletes that take big steps but don't go anywhere. Their hips don't project forward. That's why we really look at hip displacement as opposed to step length. So if we use this video as an example, we really need to be looking at the hips. Is the athlete able to project themselves forward? So here our projection isn't very optimal. And while we're talking about being able to project ourselves forward, we need to talk about orientation. So orientation is basically the direction in which we're going. Where do our forces take us? If we're in acceleration, everything needs to be going forward. We need to be pushing forward. Our orientation should be horizontal. While we're talking about orientation, there's one big thing that plays a huge role there, and that's our posture. Our posture will dictate a lot of our orientation. So that's one of the things that I go to first. What does our posture look like? Here we can see our posture is relatively straight up and down. And the next thing that we need to look at when we're talking about projection is how we move forward. Is the athlete able to extend through their hips without extending through our lower back? So if we take a look at this first step here, we can see the athlete stands up relatively quickly. So we talk about orientation, body posture, or our body angle. We're not extending through our hips here, but more so our lower back, and that's throwing off our orientation. The next thing I'm looking at are shapes. So it's really easy for us to see shapes. If I drew the silhouette of a football, you would be able to tell right away that that's a football. I teach coaches to look at the shapes because the shapes tell us a lot here. So the next thing I'm looking at is what we call switching. And my question there is, are we able to create big shapes through optimal ranges of motion in a short time frame? So if we look at this next run, we want to see big shapes. One of the things that I use to see shapes is the space between the knees. So we talk about an optimal range of motion here, and we're not using an optimal range of motion here. This would be a relatively small shape. If you look at the space between the knees, or basically the shapes that our legs are making here, this is what we would call a small shape. This isn't a big shape. So we want to see a big shape through an optimal range of motion in a short amount of time. Let's take a look at this run. So there, our shape is better. This is decent. It's still not perfect, but it's okay. But we also have to look at the time factor that we have in our question. Can we create those shapes in short time frames? So if we want to see if everything is happening quick enough, again, I'm going to look at the knees. So if we go to touchdown, so when his left leg touches the ground, I want to see where the knees are in relation to each other. So here we can see there's still a decent amount of space between the knees. Ideally, the knees would be closer together at touchdown. We look at the next step here. Knees still relatively far apart at touchdown. So we can see that we're creating decent shapes, but we're not able to get in and out of those shapes in a shorter time frame, which is extremely important for us. So you can think of switching as a relationship between agonist and antagonist muscles. So if we think about single limbs and switching, we're talking about a leg or a knee being able to punch through forward and be able to shut off everything that's flexing the hip and now turn on everything that's extending the hip. Okay, agonist and antagonist. That's switching, being able to drive through and attack back in a relatively short amount of time frame through an optimal range of motion. With both limbs, then again, we're going to look at the relationship between both legs, and I like to look at the knees to each other and how they're working together. So is one foot or one leg making a step and then we have to wait before the next leg drives through, or is everything happening simultaneously like pistons in a car? And the last thing that I'll give you to look at is what we call reactivity. So the question here is, how efficient are we on the ground? So we're looking at how efficient we are on the ground. Really, it comes down to a question of ground contact time. How long do we spend on the ground? And while we're on the subject of reactivity, we have to talk about stiffness. We hear it all the time, especially in relation to the foot. Ankle stiffness, foot complex stiffness. Stiffness is extremely important, especially when we're talking about reactivity, because one thing that we want to be able to avoid is what we call compression. So that means I make a step, for example, and instead of being able to keep my foot or my ankle relatively stiff, I have to take time to compress and then make my step. That's compression, deformation. And those are things that we want to avoid, whether it's an acceleration or upright running or even change of direction. All right, stiffness is important. So if we take a look at this run, we can see we make a pretty good shape. For the first step, the switching is actually decent, but if we look at that left leg or left foot, we can see there's a lot of compression there. So we're losing energy before we're able to make our next step. All right, so stiffness, reactivity is all about giving energy to the ground and getting energy back from the ground. But for that to happen, we need a degree of stiffness. If we're talking about stiffness, then we also need a degree of stiffness in our knee and our hip. But ankle stiffness is one of the easier things to see. So when we see these things, now we have to be able to start asking questions. What could be a possible explanation for the things that I see? When we see things, we have to now start questioning things. And from there, we can start figuring out some interventions. What are the things that we should be doing or could be doing to fix the things that we see?